class of 2002. And this is actually the first time I've been back here since I graduated. So I did it for you guys. You guys finally, something finally brought me back. It was you guys. But yeah, I'm one of the co-founders, co-owners of VaynerSports, the football representation agency. Before that, I was a president and co-owner of a football agency named Symmetry. And before that, I was started my football representation career with an agency called National Sports Management, which does not exist anymore, but had about 40 or so clients in the NFL at any given time. And before that, I was a civil litigator, concentrating mostly in business disputes, some construction law, some entertainment law. I actually represented Zab Judah once in a potential lawsuit against Don King.
He's fighting for me June 7th at Casino.
There you go. Hockey teams, I was getting invited to all their parties, everything post-game. I didn't leverage it nearly enough. I see what happens now with people trying to get jobs with us, how they leverage that. I didn't leverage it, but I certainly learned a lot. I made a lot of friends. Eventually I decided I didn't want to sit around hockey rinks recruiting 14-year-olds, freezing my feet off. So I decided to go with football. Has its own set of challenges, of course, but decided to go with football. And at the time, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to leave this law firm I'm at. I'm going to downsize. I'm just going to have my own practice. I wound up going into practice with a much more veteran attorney, just the two of us splitting costs. And I was going to be an agent on my own and just kind of be a solo agent. In the beginning of that journey, I started recruiting somebody, offensive lineman. I didn't think he was represented by anybody. The conversation lasted about a half hour. At the end of the convo, he's like, "Oh, you know what? I already have an agent." I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool. I'm not trying to poach you or step on any toes. Nice talking to you." Hangs up. 30 seconds later, the agent calls me, and I thought, "All right, I'm about to get yelled at." Instead, he offered me a job on the spot. I'd never even met this guy. So that was a lucky break. I immediately went into an agency called National Sports Management, which had about 40 or so clients at a given time. I very quickly accelerated with my contacts and my experience and all that, and then I eventually left and formed Symmetry with somebody who started off as an intern of mine, Brian McLaughlin, who quickly ascended, and we co-founded Symmetry together, which brings me to my second lucky break of my career. Back in summer of 2015, we had Symmetry, and at Symmetry we had mostly late round draft picks, undrafted guys. We started Symmetry from nothing. I didn't want to poach any of the athletes from the first firm because I left on good terms. We're just literally going to start from nothing. We were lucky enough to sign some players who made rosters. They were all undrafted. They made it. The next year we had some guys drafted. The next year had a few more guys drafted, but nobody too high up on the chain. So we got into the habit of really hustling and grinding every day. So we would check Twitter and everything for social media mentions of all our players. So one of our players was named Walter Powell back in the summer of 2015. He was originally a 6th-round pick of the Cardinals. At the time he was on the Jets, and receiver, return specialist, and I'm searching for his name, and I come across a tweet, and I see a picture of a guy wearing a Walter Powell jersey. Walter Powell's African American. This is a white guy, and nobody's wearing a Walter Powell jersey. He is pretty much unknown. I'm like, wow, this is cool. So I tweeted him. I'm like, hey, nice jersey, man. And he's like, wow, are you his agent? I'm like, yeah, I'm his agent. And he's like, here's my email address. Hit me up. I'm like, who is this guy? I click on his profile. It's some guy named Gary Vaynerchuk. Never heard of him. Had like 1.5 million followers. I'm like, I never heard of this guy. He must have bought his followers. I screen capped the Twitter account. I sent it to Brian. Have you heard of this guy? He's like, nah. He definitely bought his followers. I never heard of him either. I'm like, okay, whatever. I still emailed him. Maybe a few days later, I get a call. Male voice on the other side of the line. Mr. Vaynerchuk would like to speak with you next Tuesday at 3 o'clock for 15 minutes. I'm like, all right, I think this is pretty real. So I started researching, and back then he wasn't nearly as big a name as he is now. I probably should have still known who he was. But I researched, I'm like, all right, this is real. At the time with Symmetry, we had problems with our investors. There were 2 investor groups, and they hated each other. And I was friends with everybody in the 2 groups. none of them hated me, but there would just be a crossfire at all times, and it went on for years. We never even had an operating agreement at Symmetry. They couldn't even agree on that. And at one point, I'm like, you guys, earlier during 2015, you guys have, one or two of the groups, you guys have to leave. Like, it's making me miserable. Everything else is fine. I'm enjoying it. It was a struggle business-wise, as it always is when you're trying to get a new agency off the ground like that. But I'm like, you guys got to go. And I remember turning to Brian, I'm like, we need to find a crazy rich guy who loves sports to get us out of this situation. I don't know how we're going to do it. Fast forward to before this phone call, I'm like, Brian, I think we might have found somebody. So get on the call, 90 seconds into the call, I'm like, Gary, do you want to buy a sports agency? He's like, yes. I'm like, all right. And after that, it took several months to buy the other people out. Originally, the agency was going to stay called Symmetry, but instead we eventually decided to switch the name to VaynerSports, and now it's grown since then, and here I am. Well, there's a long answer to that. First of all, I'd say if you want to go into a sport and be an agent, try to pick something else than football. Pick a sport that's growing, that's maybe not under a players' association yet. Esports, for example, I would strongly recommend that. Get into a sport that's not well developed yet. If you can get on a frontier, that's when entry is going to be the easiest, and that's when you'll make the most amount of money and have the lowest amount of competition. I went in the other direction. I went in a fully saturated and developed sport. In terms of recruiting, there's two types of recruiting. There's veteran recruiting and college recruiting. Veteran recruiting, as a rule the NFLPA has, which we adhere to, and a lot of people don't, other people don't, but we adhere to it, where you're not supposed to actively recruit a veteran to switch agents unless it's within 90 days of the expiration of that contract, of the contract that he's on. So they have to kind of come to you first. So there's really no way to typecast that kind of recruiting. That recruiting is all over the board. First of all, you start with why you're even considering leaving your first agent, and how can you be a fit with us. We're always very careful about not violating that first rule, but ultimately it's like a friend, or occasionally the player reaches out directly. And the categories and what you need to discuss on that front can be all over the map, as opposed to college recruiting, where it's fairly consistent in terms of what you want to do. With us at VaynerSports, we're generally aiming now, we're a few years in, we launched in June of 2016, almost 3 years down the line now. We're trying to sign only guys that are going to be drafted in the top 100 spots in the draft, so it's basically the top 3 rounds. So there's a lot that goes into that. First, you have to make sure you're targeting the right player. I'll tell you guys, if anybody here is into the NFL draft, there isn't one reliable source on whose prospect level is legit out there. Like, that's for entertainment value only. Mel Kiper is an entertainer, and the rest of them are too, and this might get back to him, but that's fine. I'm going to drink at the combine. But, and they do a great job at it. The draftniks are out there for clicks and views, etc. The real deciding who is the right prospect to go after really starts more than a year before the next draft. And thankfully, that's one of the ways I got by as somebody who entered with, I had no money. I come from a total aberration, and you could do it, but it's very hard to come from the background that I came from with no natural advantages, no money. I didn't even have one internship. But I would say that if you're going to try and enter it, what matters is players. Players is what matters when you're trying to create your own football practice. Can you recruit players, and can you maintain the players? You could be the smartest capologist in the world, the most brilliant contract negotiator. You could have a previous career as an attorney that's 30 years long, winning the most brilliant cases out there. None of that matters. The guy who does not have a college degree, who can vibe with the players, recruit them and bring them with him, if he happens to switch firms, that's the person that's going to be successful. So the contract negotiation, and at least the players' contracts, everybody in this room can do an excellent job at it 2 weeks from now if you're armed with the correct information. You are negotiating in a closed environment under a collective bargaining agreement with all of the history of what everybody has been paid at that position given to you by the NFLPA. That's not the hard part. You'll learn negotiation skills here at Hofstra. I did. I was in a negotiation class. I remember it. I think it was actually right in this room. None of that part is the key to succeeding. The key to succeeding are players. And if you can show that you can get the players, you can find investment. The hard part is finding the player. So if you have a group of players that you can demonstrate that trust you, you will be able to get that investment, or you'll be able to get hired by an established firm one way or the other. So if any of you are trying to become a football agent, you probably could have just skipped law school and focused on the players. But hey, you're here right now, so you'll be able to smoke everybody in any kind of contract negotiation. And where that does come into play, though, not to talk down that side of the business too much, is when you're doing marketing deals. That's an open universe, that kind of negotiation. And when you're negotiating with Nike or Adidas or any of the true heavyweights, it's really hard to get Nike to change any part of their contract. So that's where those skills come into play. And then also, if you represent coaches, I happen to represent a few college coaches, probably will expand that in the future. That's another area where things are open-ended. And when you represent coaches, there's a very low overhead. You just have to win the business. The overhead of repping coaches is simply showing up to a game or two, showing up to the national coaching convention that happens once a year. The risk is lower. With a college player, you have to assess, make sure the player is the right player to sign, which thankfully that's how I got by. As a young agent, I made relationships with scouts very quickly. I'm strongly trusted by a bunch of people around the NFL. I've never given an ounce of info to a draftnik or any media member. Like all the feedback that comes to me, we keep very close. There's only a few people in VaynerSports that even see it. So we have to try and analyze who we even sign, and even that information can be wrong, but at least that helps you a little bit. Then you have to try and assess the level of investment in that player. And when you sign somebody that's going to be drafted in the top 100, specifically somebody who's perceived and who our information backs up is going to be a first or second round pick, now it's almost like a race to the bottom. Instead of charging 3% commission, which is what we're capped at by the NFLPA, most of the agencies are competing, including VaynerSports and Athletes First, we're only going to charge you 1% if you're a first rounder, or maybe 1.5, or maybe 2. And we're also going to give you a massive marketing advance because we think we're going to be able to make a lot of marketing money off of you. So we're going to pay you X amount of dollars that we think we're going to be able to make back because we believe in you as a player. Then there are going to be the high-profile training facilities out there that some of them do a great job, others just do a great job marketing themselves as if they did a great job, and they may not. So as you're in the business for a decade like I am, you figure out who are the contenders and who are the real training facilities out there. So they charge a pretty penny. On top of that, then you need a monthly stipend to bridge the time from the end of the college playing career until the NFL draft. They're not getting paid unless you get some marketing deals for them and then offer the marketing advance. So all that money goes together, and if you're talking about a legit first-round guy, you're in the 6 figures that you're writing a check for over the course of, at most, 90 days, sometimes way less than that. And if you're wrong, you might as well have just gone on an elaborate vacation or bought a house and invested somewhere else in the country rather than burning through 120 grand on the wrong prospect. So it is a very, very risky game being an NFL agent. So there's a lot of bars, and I'm not even talking about the annual fees and the mandatory insurance and the recruiting budget where you have to fly around the country and compete with everybody. So it's a tough business to be in, I would tell you that. So if you ever get in the business and you encounter any of these issues, don't come talking to me later. I just told you right now. I wish you luck.
I guess to build off that, just stick with you again for a second, how has it been to found and operate and compete against these other mega agencies?
Yeah, it's totally different. When the first agency I was with, when I was just kind of like an associate and ran our Boston office, that's what happens too in the sports agency world. Firms will say they have this office, that office. It's really somebody's house, or somebody's a lawyer, it's his law office. So my law office in Boston was the National Sports Management Boston office. So then we had that was like a middle ground. We had somewhat of a budget we could afford to spend With Symmetry, that was the opposite end. We had a modest investment by a bunch of people that I graduated Boston College with who were successful in business. They wrote a certain number of money into the agency, and at the time it was generous, and I certainly will always appreciate it. But with Symmetry, we had to keep the revenue revolving inside the agency, so we didn't get paid at all. I still worked as a lawyer. I worked as a rideshare driver at that time. I tried to bring in as much money outside of that business as possible. I slept about 3 hours a night for 5 years. Still had a young child at the time. So, and I'm not saying 3 hours to make it sound severe. It really was an average of 3 hours a night. I had to either make money or build the sports practice, which didn't pay me anything. Symmetry got into the black. That's because we have free labor all the time. So, and that was tough. And at that point, when you don't have a lot of resources, you're trying to go for value. So the scouting intelligence was really key there because we're looking for a diamond in the rough, such as Matt Paradis, who we signed when we were Symmetry and is now one of the highest paid centers in football. Walter Powell, the guy, the player I mentioned earlier. Many others that maybe were overlooked publicly, but because we had a really strong connection to the football intelligence community, we were able to identify and be ahead of most of the competition. So you had to be really smart and savvy back then. We know we didn't have a lot of money. Now with VaynerSports, now we have tremendous resources. Now we're competing for the top dogs in the draft. You know, we have a celebrity co-owner who can, communicate with almost everybody, who has people coming to us because of him. It's almost unfair in a certain number of ways. So but my mindset is still stuck in the scrappy Symmetry days, even though now I'm 3 years into that, because that's what brought me here, coming from a very low odds situation. And personally, I'll never switch my brain into considering who I'm in business with right now, the fact that they have a ton of resources, because that's not how I got to this table. But we are able to compete for anybody now, which it's almost surreal when you look at the path that you've been on.